Vasishta's Yoga, Part 3, on Creation, the Story of the Great Forest. Vasishta continued, O Rama, whatever might have been the origin of the mind, and whatever it might be, one should constantly direct it towards liberation through self-effort. The pure mind is free from latent tendencies, and therefore it attains self-knowledge. Since the entire universe is within the mind, the notions of bondage and liberation are also within it. In this connection, there is the following legend which I heard from the creator Brahma himself. Listen to it attentively. There was a great forest, so large that millions of square miles were like the space within an atom in it. In it, there was just one person who had 1,000 arms and limbs. He was forever restless. He had a mace in his hand with which he beat himself, and afraid of the beating, he ran away in panic. He fell into a blind well. He came out of it, again beat himself and again ran away in panic, this time into a forest. He came out of the forest, again beat himself and again ran away in panic, this time into a banana grove. Though there was no other being to fear, he wept and cried aloud in fear. He kept running as before, beating himself as before. I witnessed all this intuitively, and with the power of my will, I restrained him for a moment. I asked him, Who are you? But he was sorely distressed and called me his enemy and wept aloud and then laughed aloud. Then he began to abandon his body limb by limb. Immediately after this, I saw another person running like the first one, beating himself, weeping and wailing. When I similarly restrained him, he began to abuse me and ran away intent on his own way of life. Like this, I came across several persons. Some listened to my words and abandoning their previous way of life became enlightened. Some others ignored me or even held me in contempt. Some others even refused to come out of the blind well or the dense forest. Such is the great forest, O Rama. No one finds a sure resting place in it, whatever be the mode of life they may adopt. Even today you see such people in this world, and you yourself have seen such a life of ignorance and delusion. Because you are young and ignorant, you do not understand it. Vasishta continued, O Rama, this great forest is not far away, nor is that strange man in a strange land. This world itself is that forest. It is a great void, but this void is seen only in the light of inquiry. This light of inquiry is the I in the parable. This wisdom is accepted by some and rejected by others, who continue to suffer. They who accept it are enlightened. The persons with thousands of arms is the mind, with countless manifestations. This mind punishes itself by its own vasanas or latent tendencies and restlessly wanders in this world. The blind well in the story is hell, and the banana grove is heaven. The dense forest of thorny bush is the life of a worldly man, with the numerous thorns of wife, children, wealth, etc., hurting him all the time. The mind now wanders into hell, now into heaven, and now into the world of human beings. Even when the light of wisdom shines on the life of the deluded mind, it foolishly rejects it, considering that that wisdom is its enemy. Then it weeps and wails in distress. Sometimes it experiences an imperfect awakening, and it renounces the pleasures of the world without proper understanding. Such renunciation itself proves to be a great source of sorrow. This is the cutting of the limbs. A renunciation without proper understanding itself becomes a great source of sorrow. But when such renunciation arises out of the fullness of understanding, of wisdom born of inquiry into the nature of the mind, the renunciation leads to supreme bliss. Such a mind may even look at its own past notions of pleasure with puzzlement, just as the limbs of the person as they were cut away fell down and disappeared. The latent tendencies of the person who wisely renounces the world also vanish from the mind. Behold the play of ignorance, which makes one hurt oneself out of one's own volition, and which makes one run hither and thither in a meaningless panic. Though the light of self-knowledge shines in every heart, yet one wanders in this world driven by one's own latent desires, and the mind itself intensifies this sorrow and goads one to go round in circles. By its own whims and fancies, thoughts and hopes, it binds itself. When it is visited by sorrow, it despairs and becomes restless. When one who gains wisdom preserves it for a long time and persists in the practice of inquiry, he does not experience sorrow. An uncontrolled mind is the source of sorrow. When it is thoroughly understood, the sorrow vanishes like mist at sunrise. Vasishta continued, the individualized consciousness, the mind, has arisen in the Supreme Being. O Rama, it is both different and non-different from the infinite consciousness, even as a wave is different and non-different from the ocean. To the enlightened, the mind is the absolute Brahman and nothing else. To the unenlightened, the mind is the cause of samsara. When dualistic concepts are used by us, it is only to facilitate instruction. The division is not real. The absolute Brahman is omnipotent, and there is nothing which is outside of it. It is his own power or energy that pervades all things. In embodied beings, it is the Chit Shakti, the power of consciousness or intelligence. It is motion in air, stability in earth, void in space, and it is the power of self-consciousness. I am in created beings. Yet, all this is nothing but the power of absolute Brahman. It is the power of disintegration, the power that causes grief in the grief-stricken, and the power that causes elation in the joyous. In the warrior, it is valor. It is the power that triggers creation, and the same power brings about the dissolution of the universe. The Jiva is at the junction of consciousness and matter, and because it is a reflection of the absolute Brahman, it is said to be in Brahman. See the entire universe and also the I as the absolute Brahman, for the self, which is Brahman, is omnipresent. When that self thinks, it is known as mind. It is nothing but the power of the absolute Brahman, which is non-different from Brahman. In it, all this arbitrary division into I and this are but apparent reflections. The very reality of the mind is Brahman alone. Here and there, now and then, this power of Brahman makes manifest one or the other of its powers. But all this manifestation is but the apparent reflection of the power of Brahman, not a real creation. Thus creation, transformation, existence, and destruction are all brought about by Brahman in Brahman. It is nothing but Brahman. The instruments of action and the doer, birth, death, and existence, all this is Brahman. Nothing else is, even in imagination. Delusion, craving, greed, and attachment are non-existence. How can they exist when there is no duality? When bondage is non-existent, surely liberation is false too. Rama asked, Holy Sir, you said that when the mind thinks of something, it materializes. Now you say that bondage does not exist. How can this be reconciled? Vasishta replied, O Rama, the mind in a state of ignorance imagines bondage. This bondage exists only in that state of ignorance, just as the dream objects vanish when the dreamer wakes up. All these hallucinations known as bondage and liberation do not exist in the eyes of the enlightened. The end of the story of the great forest.